There I stood, standing at the entrance to the Palace of Versailles, a place I would never have imagined visiting under such circumstances. The French gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, silent witnesses to my hesitation. My trembling hand rested on my 8-month-old belly, the other clutching a small, poorly wrapped package. The noise of the festivities escaped through the half-open doors, a mixture of laughter, classical music, and the clinking of glasses that contrasted violently with the tumult of my thoughts. It was the wedding of my husband's brother, Theo, an event to which I had not been invited, officially. The words of Lucas, my husband, still echoed in my head, "Stay home, Elodie. Rest. No one will notice your absence." His tone, full of barely veiled contempt, had hurt me more than I wanted to admit. But there I was, defying his orders, convinced that my place was among the family, despite everything. I took a deep breath, mustering up what little courage I had left. My heart pounded as I crossed the threshold, entering a world of luxury and opulence that seemed so far removed from my daily reality. The ballroom was sumptuous, illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the elegantly dressed guests. The floral arrangements, a clever mix of white roses and lilies, filled the air with a delicate perfume. As soon as I entered, I felt eyes turn towards me. Murmurs rose up, forming a wave that spread through the crowd. My simple dress, although pretty, clashed terribly with the haute couture outfits around me. I felt like an intruder, a blot on a perfect picture. My eyes scanned the room anxiously, searching for a familiar face, for a refuge in this sea of strangers. It was then that I saw him. Lucas was standing near the bar, a glass of champagne in hand, surrounded by a group of men in suits. Our eyes met and I saw his face harden instantly. The anger that darkened his features made me shiver. He apologized to his companions and walked decisively towards me. Each of his steps sounded like a countdown in my head. I knew I was going to pay for my disobedience, but I couldn't back down now. "What are you doing here?" he hissed through his teeth, grabbing my arm with a force that made me wince. "I told you to stay home." I tried to remain calm, aware of the curious looks around us. I just wanted to share this moment with the family, Lucas. It's your brother's wedding, after all." His grip tightened, his fingers digging into my flesh. "You have no business here. You're embarrassing us with your appearance." His words hurt me deeply, but I refused to let him see how much he was hurting me. "You didn't think I was going to stay locked in the house while everyone celebrated?" I replied, my trembling voice betraying my anxiety. Lucas glanced around, clearly embarrassed by the attention we were attracting. He pulled me to a more discreet corner of the room, away from prying eyes. I followed him, my heart beating wildly, torn between fear and a feeling of rebellion that was growing within me. "Listen to me carefully, Elodie," he whispered in a threatening tone. "You're going to leave here immediately. I don't want to see you ruin this day for Theo and Sarah." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I held them back. "I am your wife, Lucas. The mother of your child. I have as much right to be here as anyone else." His face twisted into a grimace of disgust. "You're nothing but a burden. Look at you, you look ridiculous in that dress. Do you really think anyone wants to see you like that?" Every word was like a stab. I looked down at my belly, feeling our baby move as if to remind me of his presence. This little life in me gave me the strength to raise my head. "I'm not leaving, Lucas. I came to celebrate with the family, and that's what I'm going to do." His jaw clenched, and I saw a dangerous glint light up in his eyes. Before I could react, he raised his hand. I closed my eyes, waiting for the blow, but it never came. "Lucas," a female voice interrupted our confrontation. I opened my eyes to see Marie, Lucas' mother, approaching us. His face showed a forced smile, but his eyes betrayed his concern. "Ah, Elodie, my darling. I didn't know you were coming," she said, kissing me on both cheeks. Its expensive scent enveloped me, reminding me how foreign I was to this world. Lucas dropped his hand, his face instantly returning to a neutral expression. "Mom, Elodie wasn't feeling well. I was just going to take her home." Marie looked at me with false sympathy. "Oh, poor thing. This really isn't a place for a woman in your condition. You should rest." I felt trapped, stuck between my mother-in-law's false concern and my husband's barely contained anger. But something inside me refused to give in. "I'm fine, thank you, Marie," I replied with a forced smile. I really wanted to be there for Theo and Sarah. Marie exchanged a look with Lucas, one of those meaningful looks that only members of a family can understand. "Of course, my dear. But promise me not to push too hard. These events can be so tiring." I nodded, grateful for the momentary respite. Lucas, feeling that he could no longer force me to leave without creating a scandal, left reluctantly, not without giving me one last warning look. Left alone with Marie, I tried to find my bearings in this sparkling crowd. My mother-in-law, true to her role as the perfect hostess, began to introduce me to a few guests, while keeping a firm hand on my arm, as if to make sure I didn't stray too far. The hours that followed were a whirlwind of unfamiliar faces, polite conversations and forced smiles. I constantly felt Lucas gaze on me, watching me from afar. Despite the beauty of the place and the apparent cheerfulness of the event, I felt more alone than ever. The long-awaited moment of the ceremony finally arrived. Theo and Sarah exchanged their vows in the castle gardens. Under a flowered arch standing at the back of the congregation, I observed the scene with a mixture of joy for the couple and sadness for my own situation. The words of love and eternal devotion rang like cruel irony in my ears. As the guests applauded the newlyweds, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The fatigue, stress, and emotion of the day began to weigh heavily on me. I quietly excused myself and headed to the bathroom, looking for a moment of respite. In the relative calm of the luxurious bathroom, I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection gave me the image of an exhausted woman, with dark circles under her eyes and a pale complexion. I ran cold water over my face, trying to regain my composure. That's when I heard the door open. Lucas entered, locking the door behind him. His face was a mask of suppressed fury. "Did you get what you wanted?" he asked in a low, menacing voice. "Did you manage to make a spectacle of yourself?" I instinctively stepped back, my back hitting the cold marble of the sink. "Lucas, please. I just wanted to be there for your brother." He approached, invading my personal space. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. "You're lying. You came to provoke me, to ridicule me in front of everyone." Fear paralyzed me, but a small voice inside me refused to be silenced. "No, Lucas. I have a right to be here. I'm part of this family, whether you like it or not." His eyes darkened dangerously. "You're not part of anything at all. You're just a mistake. A burden I have to carry around." His words hurt me deeply, but they also awakened something in me. A long-repressed anger, a desire to fight for my dignity. "I am your wife, Lucas. The mother of your child. How can you treat me like this?" He chuckled, a mirthless sound that made my blood run cold. "My wife. You are nothing more than an obligation. A youthful mistake that I carry around like a ball and chain." Each word was like a stab, but I refused to look down. "If that's what you really think, then maybe we should." I didn't have time to finish my sentence. Lucas' hand came down on my cheek with a force that made me sway. Pain exploded in my face, and I felt the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. Shocked, I brought my hand to my cheek, my eyes wide with disbelief. Lucas looked at me, his hand still raised, as if surprised by his own gesture. A heavy silence settled between us, broken only by the muffled noise of the music that reached us from the reception room. In this suspended moment, I realized that something had just broken irreparably between us. The bathroom door opened suddenly, startling Lucas. An elderly woman, whom I recognized as a family friend, looked at us in amazement. "What's going on here?" she asked, her gaze moving from my flushed face to Lucas' guilty expression. I took this opportunity to escape, bumping into Lucas in the process. I rushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares and whispers as I passed. My only goal was to get out of this place, to get away from Lucas and this family who had never really accepted me. As I walked through the castle gates, the cool night air hit my face, mixing its tears with mine. I stopped for a moment, a hand on my stomach, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. It was at that moment that I really became aware of my situation. Alone, pregnant, with no place to go. The reality of what I had just experienced hit me hard. This wasn't just another argument, it was a point of no return. As I started walking down the aisle, not really knowing where I was going, I heard rapid footsteps behind me. My heart sank, fearing it was Lucas. But the voice that called me was that of Sarah, Theo's new wife. Elodie. Wait. I turned to see the bride running towards me, her white dress flowing behind her like a ghost in the night. She stopped in front of me, out of breath, her eyes bright with worry. What happened? I saw Lucas coming out of the bathroom. He looked. I don't know, but something was wrong. I tried to smile, but my lips were trembling too much. It's nothing, Sarah. I wasn't feeling well. I'm going to go home and rest. Sarah looked at me, unconvinced. She gently took my hand in hers. Sarah looked at me with growing concern, her eyes searching my face for answers I wasn't ready to give. The silence between us was heavy, full of unsaid words and unacknowledged fears. I felt like I had to say something, anything, to break this unbearable tension. Sarah, it's your wedding. You should be inside, celebrating with Theo and all your guests, I said in a voice that I wanted to be firm but which shook despite myself. She shook her head, her blonde curls dancing in the light evening breeze. Elodie, I can't celebrate knowing something is wrong. You're family now, whether Lucas likes it or not. These words, spoken with such sincerity, touched me deeply. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone truly cared about me, beyond appearances and social conventions. My eyes filled with tears that I could no longer hold back. Sarah gently hugged me, paying attention to my protruding belly. This gesture of tenderness broke down the last barriers that I had erected around my heart. The sobs I had held back for so long finally burst forth, shaking my entire body. Oh, Elodie, Sarah whispered, rocking me gently. What did he do to you? Between two hiccups, I began to tell him. The words poured out of my mouth like a torrent, carrying with them months of pain and loneliness. I told him about the insults, the daily humiliations, how Lucas made me feel like I was nothing more than a burden to him and his family. And then, finally, I confessed to him what had just happened in the castle toilets. Sarah listened to me in silence, her face changing from surprise to horror to a cold anger I'd never seen in her before. When I finished speaking, she took my face in her hands, forcing me to look into her eyes. Listen to me carefully, Elodie. What Lucas is putting you through is unacceptable. You don't deserve this. No one deserves this. You need to leave, get yourself and your baby to safety. His words, although full of kindness, made me panic. Leave. But to go where? I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. My family was far away, and I had lost contact with most of my friends since my marriage to Lucas. I can't, Sarah, I stammered. I have nowhere to go. Besides, it's your wedding. I don't want to ruin it. She interrupted me with a wave of her hand. Don't worry about the wedding. Your safety is far more important than any ceremony. Just then we heard voices approaching. My heart sank as I recognized Lucas's, slightly mushy from the alcohol. Sarah reacted quickly, pushing me behind a nearby grove. Stay here, she whispered. I'll take care of him. I hide in the shade of the shrubs, my heart racing. From my hiding place, I could see Lucas approaching Sarah, accompanied by Theo and a few other guests. Ah, Sarah, what are you doing outside? Lucas asked, his voice falsely jovial. Sarah stood up, adopting a posture that I didn't know. She suddenly seemed bigger, more imposing. I was getting some fresh air, she replied icily. And I was thinking about the best way to tell you how much you disgust me, Lucas. A shocked silence fell over the group. Lucas, taken aback, stammered, what? But what are you talking about? I'm talking about the way you treat your wife, you coward, Sarah spat. How dare you lay a hand on her? And what's more, on our wedding day? Theo stepped forward, looking confused and worried. Sarah, what are you talking about? Lucas didn't do anything. Shut up, Theo, Sarah interrupted. Your brother is a monster. He has been mistreating Elodie for months, and tonight he hit her in the castle toilets. The guests began to whisper among themselves, casting wary glances at Lucas. The latter, feeling that he was losing control of the situation, tried to defend himself. "It's nonsense. Elodie is inventing all this to attract attention. You know her, she's always been." "Shut up." Sarah's voice cracked like a whip. I saw the marks on his face. I heard his fear. "You can't lie anymore, Lucas." From my hiding place, I watched the scene unfold, torn between fear and a strange feeling of relief. For the first time, someone stood up for me, exposed what I had endured in silence for so long. Theo, visibly shaken by Sarah's revelations, turned to his brother. "Lucas, tell me it's not true. Tell me you didn't do it." Lucas, cornered, dropped his mask of good nature. His face twisted into an angry grimace. "So what? What does it matter to you, her? She's my wife, I do what I want with her." These words, spoken with such hatred and contempt, had the effect of a bomb. The guests backed away, shocked by the violence of his statement. Theo remained frozen in place, as if he was seeing his brother for the first time. It was then that I decided to come out of my hiding place. I couldn't stand there anymore, letting them fight for me. It was time for me to take charge of my life, to face Lucas once and for all. When I emerged from the bushes, all eyes were on me. I saw surprise, then anger light up in Lucas' eyes. But for once, I didn't look down. I stood straight, one hand protectively on my stomach, the other clenched into a determined fist. "It's true," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Everything Sarah said is true. Lucas has been mistreating me for months. He insults me, belittles me, and now has come to blows." A murmur of indignation ran through the assembly. Lucas, mad with rage, took a step towards me. "You!" But before he could reach me, Theo intervened. With a quick movement, he grabbed his brother's arm, twisting it behind his back. "That's enough, Lucas. You'll never touch her again." Lucas struggled, but Theo held him firmly. "Let me go. You don't understand, she's lying. She's just trying to." "Stop," Theo cut him off, his voice trembling with suppressed anger. "I saw the way you looked at her tonight. I saw the fear in her eyes. I should have understood sooner, I should have done something." While Theo restrained Lucas, Sarah approached me, putting a protective arm around my shoulders. "It's going to be okay now, Elodie. You're no longer alone." These words, so simple and yet so powerful, made me burst into tears. All the tension, fear, and loneliness that I had accumulated over the past few months seemed to dissolve in these liberating tears. One of the guests, a man of around 50 with a distinguished appearance, came forward. "I called the police," he announced. "They'll be here in a few minutes." Lucas, hearing this, redoubled his efforts to free himself. "You can't do that. She's my wife, it's a private matter." "Not anymore," the man replied. "Domestic violence is a crime, Lucas. You will have to answer for your actions." The minutes that followed were surreal. The wedding guests, who hours earlier had been laughing and dancing carefreely, now formed a circle around us, silent witnesses to the abrupt end of my marriage. When the police sirens sounded in the distance, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension wash over me. What was going to happen now? How was I going to cope, alone and pregnant? As if reading my thoughts, Sarah squeezed my hand. "You're going to come to our place, Elodie. We have a guest room, you'll be safe there by the time you turn around." I looked at her, amazed by her generosity. "But, it's your wedding night. I can't." Theo, who had entrusted Lucas to 2 strong guests while waiting for the police to arrive, joined us. "Sarah is right," he said softly. "We won't leave you alone at a time like this. You're part of the family, Elodie, no matter what my idiot brother says." The police cars arrived, their blue lights illuminating the night. 2 officers approached, looking serious. One of them, a woman of around 40 with a kind look, came towards me. "Madam, I'm Lieutenant Dubois. We were called about a case of domestic violence. Can you tell me what happened?" As I gave my statement, out of the corner of my eye I saw Lucas being handcuffed and taken to a police car. Our eyes met for a brief moment. In his eyes, I saw no remorse or regret, just a cold anger that made me shiver. When it was all over, when the guests began to leave and the castle gradually emptied, I found myself sitting on a bench in the garden, exhausted but strangely serene. Sarah and Theo were at my side, silent but present. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, tinting the sky pink and gold. It was a new day dawning, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was a new beginning for me too. "What am I going to do now?" I murmured, more to myself than to my companions. Sarah took my hand in hers. "You're going to rest, first. Then, we'll help you rebuild. You're not alone, Elodie. Never again." Theo nodded solemnly. "We'll be there every step of the way. For you, and for the baby." As we got up to leave, I took one last look at the castle that had been the scene of that tumultuous night. I felt like a page was turning, that I was leaving behind not only Lucas, but also the self-effacing and submissive woman that I had become at his side. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it seemed full of promise rather than threat. I had found unexpected allies, and with their help, I was ready to face whatever life had in store for me. As we got into Theo's car, I felt my baby moving in my belly. I placed my hand on my abdomen, a small smile on my lips. "We'll get through this, little one," I whispered. "Together we will build a new life. A better life." And as the car drove away from the castle, I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. The road would be long and likely difficult, but for the first time in months, I had hope. And this hope was worth more than all the castles in the world. The car ride was in heavy silence. Theo drove, eyes glued to the road, while Sarah, sitting in the back seat with me, held my hand, her thumb tracing comforting circles on my palm. The landscape passed through the window, the first light of dawn giving the world outside a surreal tint that perfectly matched my state of mind. We finally arrived in front of a pretty suburban house, nestled in the heart of a peaceful neighborhood. It was there that Theo and Sarah had planned to begin their life as a married couple. I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt at the thought of intruding on what should have been their wedding night. "Don't worry," Sarah whispered, as if reading my thoughts. "We're happy to have you with us." Theo turned off the engine and turned towards us. His face bore the marks of fatigue and worry. "Welcome to our home, Elodie. It's not much, but you will be safe there." We entered the house, and I was immediately struck by the warmth emanating from it. Photos of Theo and Sarah adorned the walls, testifying to their love and complicity. It was everything my marriage to Lucas had never been. Sarah led me to the guest bedroom, a comfortable room with pale blue walls. "Rest," she said softly. "We'll talk about all that later." I lay on the bed, physically and emotionally exhausted. Despite the whirlwind of thoughts that racked my mind, I quickly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. It took me a moment to remember where I was and why. The events of the previous night came back to me, causing a wave of nausea that I struggled to suppress. I stood up slowly, taking the time to stretch my aching body. My reflection in the dresser mirror made me wince. My eyes were swollen, my hair was messy, and my dress from the day before was wrinkled. But what struck me most was the expression in my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I no longer saw the fear that had taken up residence there. Instead, there was a glimmer of determination, fragile but very present. I left the bedroom and headed towards the kitchen, where the sounds of conversation were coming from. Theo and Sarah were sitting at the table, talking in low voices. They fell silent as I approached, looking up at me with worried looks. "Hello," I said, my voice still hoarse from sleep. "What time is it?" "Almost noon," Sarah replied, getting up to pour me a cup of coffee. "You needed some rest." I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the warm cup as if it could protect me from the outside world. "Thank you," I whispered. "For everything." Theo shook his head. "You don't have to thank us, Elodie. We should have seen what was happening much sooner. I'm sorry I didn't understand." I looked up at him, surprised by the guilt I saw on his face. "It's not your fault, Theo. Lucas, he was good at hiding things." A silence ensued, everyone lost in their thoughts. It was Sarah who finally broke it. "Elodie, we need to talk about what's going to happen now." The police will probably want to see you again to complete your statement. I felt my stomach twist at the thought. Confronting Lucas had been one thing, but the idea of having to tell strangers everything in detail terrified me. I don't know if I can do this, I stammered. You don't have to do it right away, Theo said softly. But you'll have to do it at some point if you want Lucas to be punished for what he did to you. I knew he was right, but the very idea paralyzed me. How could I put into words months of suffering and humiliation? Just then the front doorbell rang, startling us all. Theo got up to open the door, while Sarah placed a comforting hand on my arm. I heard voices in the hall, then footsteps coming closer. When Theo returned to the kitchen, he was accompanied by a man I didn't know. Tall, in his 50s, he exuded an aura of natural authority that made me instinctively sit up straighter in my chair. Elodie, said Theo, let me introduce you to Monsieur Lefevre. He is the CEO of the company where Theo works, the man interrupted, walking towards me with his hand outstretched. But today I am here in a personal capacity. I squeezed his hand, confused. What was Theo's boss doing here? And why was he looking at me with so much intensity? Mr. Lefevre took a chair and sat down opposite me. His gaze never left me, as if he was searching for something in my features. Elodie, he began in a soft voice, I know that what I am about to tell you will seem incredible to you, but I ask you to listen to me until the end. I nodded, more and more intrigued. 28 years ago, he continued, I had a brief affair with a woman named Marie Durand. We were young, carefree, and when she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I gave him some money to fix it, and I left. My heart began to beat harder. Marie Durand was my mother's name. It was only years later that I learned that she had kept the child. A girl. I tried to find her, but Marie had disappeared. I hired private detectives, I moved heaven and earth, but I never succeeded in locating them. He paused, his eyes shining with suppressed emotion. Until last night, when I saw you at Theo's wedding. You are the spitting image of your mother at the same age. I stood frozen, unable to speak, move, even breathe. Mr. Lefevre's words echoed in my head, shattering everything I thought I knew about my past. Elodie, he said softly, I am your father. The world seemed to stop spinning. I stared at this man, this stranger who claimed to be my father, searching in his features for a resemblance to mine. And I found it. The shape of his eyes, the curve of his nose, the line of his jaw, it was like looking at an older, male version of myself. It's impossible, I finally whispered. My mother always told me that my father died before I was born. Mr. Lefevre shook his head sadly. I understand why she said that. What I did, it was cowardly and unforgivable. I didn't deserve to be your father. I felt tears streaming down my cheeks, without even realizing it. All my life, I had believed that my father was a tragic hero who died too soon. Finding out that he was actually a man who had abandoned my mother was a shock I wasn't prepared to handle. Sarah, who had remained silent until then, took my hand in hers. Elodie, I know this is a lot to take in. If you want him to leave. I shook my head. Despite the shock and confusion, part of me wanted to know more. Wanted to understand. Why now? I asked Mr. Lefevre. Why come see me now, after all these years? He sighed deeply. When I saw you last night, I knew immediately who you were. And then, I saw what happened with your husband. I saw the way he treated you, and that reminded me of my own cowardice all those years ago. I couldn't stand by this time. His words hit me hard. This man, this father I had never known, had witnessed my humiliation. Part of me wanted to reject him, tell him to leave and never come back. But another part, a part one didn't know, felt strangely relieved. As if a void that I had always worn in me was finally starting to fill. What do you want from me? I asked, my voice barely higher than a whisper. Mr. Lefevre leaned forward, his eyes immersed in mine. I want to help you, Elodie. I know that I have no right to land in your life like that, but I want to try to catch up all these lost years. If you allow me, of course. I remained silent, weighing his words. Could I trust this man? Could I give him a chance when he had abandoned me even before I was born? But as I thought, I realized something. For the first time in my life, I had the choice. The choice to accept or reject this man. The choice to give him a chance or turn his back on him. And this choice, this freedom to decide for myself, was something that Lucas had never granted me. I took a deep breath. I can't promise you anything, I said slowly. But I'm ready to try. To know you. Mr. Lefever's face illuminated with a smile that strangely reminded me of the one I sometimes saw in the mirror. It's more than I dared to hope, he said slowly. Thank you, Elodie. Theo and Sarah exchanged a look, then Theo scraped her throat. Mr. Lefever, maybe you could help us. Elodie will need support to file a complaint against Lucas and, of course, interrupted him Mr. Lefever. I will put my lawyers at his disposal. No one will hurt my daughter without suffering the consequences. These words, pronounced with so much conviction, made me shiver. For the first time for a long time, I felt protected. Safe. While the conversation continued around me, I put a hand on my belly, feeling my baby's movements. It looks like things will change for us, my little one, I whispered. Maybe finally, we will be entitled to our happy ending. And for the first time in months, I surprised myself to smile. A real smile, full of hope and promises for the future. The days that followed spent in a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Mr. Lefever, no, my father, I had to get used to calling him, held his promise. He put at my disposal a team of experienced lawyers to help me file a complaint against Lucas and to start a divorce procedure. Every morning, I woke up with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The apprehension came from the uncertainty of my situation, from the fear that Lucas could in one way or another return to my life. But hope, he grew up every day a little more, fed by the support of Theo, Sarah, and my newly found father. One morning, when I had my breakfast in Theo and Sarah's kitchen, my father arrived, a file under the arm and a determined expression on the face. Hello, Elodie, he said, sitting in front of me. How do you feel today? I put my cup of tea, reflecting on the question. Better, I think. The morning nausea are starting to fade. He nodded, a little smile. This is good news. Listen, I have something to show you. He opened the file he had brought and released a bundle of documents. I did some research on Lucas, he started. And what I found? Well, let's say it doesn't play in his favor. I felt my heart accelerated. What do you mean? My father took a deep inspiration. It seems that Lucas had similar problems in the past. Before married, he had a relationship with a woman named Claire. She filed a complaint against him for domestic violence, but withdrew her complaint under pressure from Lucas' family. I was speechless, assimilating this new information. I didn't know, I whispered. That's not all, continued my father. I also discovered that Lucas has significant game debts. It seems that he used part of the family business to reimburse them. These revelations struck me like a punch. The man I had married, the man I thought I knew, was only a tissue of lies and secrets. Why are you telling me all that? I asked, my voice barely higher than a whisper. My father put his hand on mine. Because I want you to understand that none of this is your fault, Elodie. Lucas is a manipulator, a violent man who managed to deceive everyone, not just you. His words, although they aimed to comfort me, opened the valves of my emotions. The tears that I had retained for days began to flow freely on my cheeks. I should have known, I sobbed. I should have seen the signs. My father got up and came to kneel next to me, taking me in his arms. It was the first time that he had a hug me, and despite the situation, I couldn't help but notice how much it seemed just. You couldn't know, he whispered. Manipulators like Lucas are experts to hide their true nature. But now you are free from him. And I promise you that I will do everything in my power so that he can never hurt you again. We thus stayed for a long time, my sobs gradually calming. When I finally calmed down, my father straightened up, wiping a tear that had flowed on his own cheek. There is something else I wanted to tell you about, he said slowly. I have a country house, not far from here. It is a quiet place, far from everything. I told myself that maybe, if you want, you could go to rest a little. Take time for you, far from all this agitation. The idea was tempting. As grateful as I was towards Theo and Sarah for their hospitality, I started to feel the need to have my own space. I don't know, I hesitate. What if Lucas found me there? My father shook his head. It is impossible. No one knows the existence of this house apart from me. And I will hire a bodyguard to watch over you if it can reassure you. I think for a moment. The idea of being alone scared me a little, but at the same time, I needed time to digest everything that had happened to me in recent days. Okay, I said finally. I would like to go. My father's face illuminated. Perfect. I'm going to organize everything so that you can go there tomorrow if you want. The next morning, after having farewell to Theo and Sarah by promising them to stay in touch, I went up in my father's car. The journey to the country house was made in a comfortable silence, punctuated by some light conversations on the weather or the landscape. When we finally arrived, I was blown away. The country house was actually a magnificent 19th century manor, surrounded by a large well-maintained garden. It's beautiful, I whispered, amazed. My father smiles, visibly happy with my reaction. I'm glad you like it. Come on, I'm going to show you around. The interior was just as impressive as the outside. Old furniture rubbed shoulders with modern equipment, creating an atmosphere that is both warm and luxurious. My father showed me my room, a spacious suite with a view of the garden, then gave me in the living room. Listen, Elodie, he said, sitting on one of the sofas. I know that all is new to you. That I am new to you. I want you to know that I do not expect anything. You can take all the time you need to adapt, to think about what you want for the future. I sat in front of him, touched by his consideration. Thank you, I said slowly. It is true that all this is a little surreal. There are still so much that I do not know about you, on my mother, on your story. My father nodded, a glimmer of sadness in the eyes. I know. And I am ready to answer all your questions, when you feel ready to ask them. A silence settled between us, but for once, it was not an embarrassed silence. It was a silence full of promises, hope for the future. You know, said my father finally, when I learned that your mother was pregnant, I panicked. I was young, ambitious. I thought that it would become a father would ruin all my projects. But now I realize that it was the biggest error in my life. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. Why have you never tried to meet before? He sighed deeply. I tried. When I finally made my mistake, years later, I hired detectives to find you, your mother and you. But she had covered her traces. Not that I am part of your life. I thought back to my mother, how she had always avoided my father's subject. She always told me that you were dead before my birth, I whispered. My father closed his eyes, visibly injured by this revelation. I understand why she did that. What I did was unforgivable. And yet, here I am, I said gently, ready to try to forgive you. He reopened his eyes, looking at me with an intensity that disturbed me. You are extraordinary, Elodie. Much stronger than I have never been. These words touched me more than I would have thought it possible. For so long, I thought I was weak, that I deserved the treatment that Lucas inflicted on me. To hear my father tell me that I was strong, it was as if a part of me, long buried, was starting to be reborn. I don't feel very strong, I admitted. But I try to become it. For me, and for my baby. My father got up and came to sit next to me. You are already strong, Elodie. You have survived things that nobody should have to endure. And now you are there, ready to start again. Give a chance to a father who may not deserve it, its strength. I put my head on her shoulder, letting her words develop me like a comforting blanket. For the first time for a long time, I felt safe, loved, valued. So, said my father after a while, what would you like to do during your stay here? I think for a moment. I would like to get to know you. And maybe you could help me rediscover who I am, who I want to be. He smiles, his eyes brilliant with emotion. Nothing would make me happy, my darling. While the sun started to bed, bathing the living room with a golden light, I realized that for the first time in years, I was looking forward to seeing what the future reserved for me. The path would be long and probably difficult, but I was no longer alone. I had a family, support, And above all, I had hope. And with that, I knew I could face anything. The weeks passed, transforming in months. Time seemed to flow differently in this country house, far from the tumult of my life before. Each day brought its share of small victories, a spontaneous smile, one night without nightmares, the growing feeling of safety. My father, faithful to his word, was present without being invasive. Our conversations, first awkward and hesitant, became more and more natural. I discovered a complex man, with his strengths and weaknesses, far from the idealized image of the absent father that I had built in my child's mind. One morning, when I had my breakfast on the terrace, savoring the sweetness of the spring sun, my father arrived, with his face serious. "Elodie," he said, sitting in front of me, "I have news about Lucas." I felt my heart accelerated. Despite the months spent, the simple fact of hearing his name was still enough to make me uncomfortable. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep a firm voice. My father took a deep inspiration. "The prosecutor has decided to continue Lucas for domestic violence, financial fraud, and several other charges. The trial begins next week." I remained silent for a moment, assimilating the information. Part of me was relieved that justice was finally done, but another part feared having to relive all these painful moments. Should I testify?" I finally asked, my voice barely higher than a whisper. My father slowly nodded. "Yes, my darling. Your testimony will be crucial. But I promise you that you will not be alone. I will be there, as well as our lawyers. And Theo and Sarah also proposed to support you." I felt the tears getting in my eyes, touched by so much support. "Okay," I said, taking a deep inspiration. "I will do it. For me, for my baby, and for all the other women who could fall between her claws if you don't stop it." My father looked at me proudly. "You are so courageous, Elodie. I'm so proud of you." The days that followed were intense. I spent hours with the lawyers, preparing my testimony, reliving every painful moment of my marriage to Lucas. It was emotionally exhausting, but in a way, it was also cathartic. Whenever I told my story, I felt a little more the weight of guilt and shame lightening my shoulders. The day of the trial finally arrived. The Paris courthouse was imposing, its stone columns seeming to taunt me while I climbed the steps, my father on one side, Sarah on the other. Theo followed us, a reassuring presence. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. I felt all the eyes turn to me when we entered the courtroom. And then, I live it. Lucas, sitting next to his lawyer, looks pale and defeated in his dark costume. Our eyes met for a short moment, and I was surprised not to feel the fear that had paralyzed me so long. Instead, I only felt pity for this broken man. The trial began. The lawyers presented their arguments, the witnesses succeeded themselves at the helm. I listened, with a tight heart, the testimonies of Claire, the ex-girlfriend of Lucas, and several employees of the family business who confirmed financial embezzlement. And then it was my turn. When I was called to the bar, I felt my legs tremble. But by crossing my father's encouraging look, I drew into me a force that I did not know myself. I started to speak, my voice first hesitant, then more and more assured. I told everything: insults, humiliations, blows. I described the constant fear in which I lived in, the way Lucas had systematically destroyed my esteem from me. And then, I spoke of this night of marriage, of violence which had finally broken out in broad daylight. Throughout my testimony, I refused to watch Lucas. I kept my eyes fixed on my father, drawing from his presence the strength to continue. When I finished, a heavy silence reigned in the room. I saw tears in the eyes of certain jurors, and even the judge seemed moved. Lucas' lawyer tried to destabilize me during the counter-examination, insinuating that I exaggerated, that I was an unstable woman who sought to take revenge. But I was firm, did not let myself be intimidated. Whenever he tried to make me doubt, I remembered that I was no longer this frightened and submissive woman. I was strong, I was a survivor. After what seemed to be an eternity, the trial was coming to an end. The final pleadings were pronounced, and the jury withdrew to deliberate. The wait was endless. I stayed sitting between my father and Sarah, their hands tightening mine, drawing comfort from their presence. Finally, After several hours, the jury returned. My heart was beating so hard that I felt like the whole room could hear it. The president of the jury got up, his serious face. In the case between the prosecution and Lucas Dubois, we, members of the jury, declares the accused guilty of all the counts. A hubbub stood in the room. I remained frozen, unable to achieve what had just happened. It was only when my father hugged me that I finally let my tears run. Tears of relief, release. The judge pronounced the sentence, 10 years in prison for Lucas, as well as a life ban to contact me or approach me or our child. It was over. Really finished. While we left the courthouse, a cloud of journalists awaited us. The flashes crackled, the questions were rushing from all sides. My father guided me through the crowd, protecting me from prying eyes. Once in the car, I finally let the tension fall. "It's over," I whispered, still incredulous. My father hugged my hand. "Yes, my darling. It's over. You're free now." On the way back to the country house, I remained silent, lost in my thoughts. A page of my life had just turned, and a new one opened in front of me. For the first time in a long time, I really felt free. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. The media seized the case, making me, in spite of me, the symbol of the fight against domestic violence. I received hundreds of messages of support, women who recognized themselves in my story and who drew the strength to get out of their own abuse situation. One evening, when I walked in the garden, my father joined me. He looked concerned. "Elodie," he said slowly, "I have something to offer you." I looked at him, intrigued. "What is this?" He took a deep inspiration. "I have thought a lot lately. About you, your story, all those women who have experienced what you have experienced. And I said to myself, and if we could do something to help them?" I frowned, not understanding where he was coming from. "I would like to create a foundation," he continued. "A foundation that would help women victims of domestic violence, who would offer them refuge, legal and psychological support. And I would like you to be the president." I was speechless, surprised by this unexpected proposal. "Me? But I know nothing about the operation of a foundation." My father smiles. "You have something much more important than technical knowledge. You have experience, compassion, and now, the strength of someone who has survived and who has rebuilt. You could be a source of inspiration for so many women." I think for a moment. The idea was intimidating, but at the same time, exciting. It was the opportunity to transform my pain into something positive, to give meaning to everything I had gone through. "Okay," I said finally. "I want to do it. I want to help these women as I would have liked to be helped." My father's face illuminated. "I'm so proud of you, Elodie. You're going to do great things, I'm sure." That night, lying in my bed, a hand on my belly where I felt my baby's movements, I think about everything that had happened in recent months. I had crossed hell, but I was getting stronger. I had lost a husband, but I had won a father. And now I had a new goal in life. I thought of all these women who, like me, lived in fear and shame. I thought of the little girl I was wearing, and the world in which I wanted her to grow up. A world where no woman would have to undergo what I had undergone. "We're going to get there, my darling," I whispered to my baby. "We are going to change things, you and me. And maybe one day, no more women will have to live what I have experienced." With this promise, I closed my eyes, ready to face what the future reserved for me. For the first time in a long time, this future seemed to me bright, full of possibilities and hope. The months following the trial was a whirlwind of activity. The creation of the foundation occupied most of my time and my energy, but it was a job that fascinated me. Each day brought its share of challenges, but also small victories that filled me with pride. We had chosen to call our organization New Start, a name that sounded deeply in me. It was exactly what I had experienced, and what I wanted to offer to other women in similar situations. One spring morning, when I was preparing for an important meeting, I felt acute pain in the lower belly. I breathed deeply, trying to calm down, but the pain only intensified. With a mixture of excitement and apprehension, I realized that the time had come. My baby was going to be born. I called my father, who arrived in record time. The journey to the hospital was vague, the pain of contractions black out everything else. Once installed in the hospital room, surrounded by doctors and nurses, I was seized with sudden fear. What if I was not able to be a good mother? What if the trauma of my past affected my ability to love this child? As if he read in my thoughts, my father took my hand. "You're going to get there, Elodie," he whispered. "You are the strongest person I know. This baby is lucky to have you as a mother." His words gave me the strength I needed. The hours that followed were intense, painful, but also wonderful. And then, finally, I heard my baby's first cry. A girl. My daughter. When the nurse posed it on my chest, I was overwhelmed by a wave of love so powerful that she cut my breath. She was so small, so perfect. Her eyes, when she opened them briefly, were deep blue, like those of my father. "Hello, my darling," I whispered, tears in my eyes. "I'm your mom." My father, who watched the scene with shiny eyes of emotion, approached gently. "She is magnificent, Elodie," he said in a trembling voice. "What are you going to call her?" I looked at my daughter, reflective. "And then, I know. Hope," I said. "Her name is Hope." My father smiles, including the meaning of this choice. Hope, because she represented all the hope that I had for the future. Hope, because it was living proof that even after the darkest moments, life could still offer miracles. The weeks following the birth of Hope were a mixture of intense joy and total exhaustion. I learned to be a mother, discovering new facets of this unconditional love that I felt for my daughter every day. My father was invaluable, always ready to help me or take over when I needed rest. Despite the short nights and the busy days, I continued to work on the foundation. Hope often accompanied me during the meetings, sleeping peacefully in his briefs while we discussed strategies and projects. One day, when Esperance was about 3 months old, we inaugurated the first refuge of New Departure. It was a big house in the Parisian suburbs, capable of accommodating around 20 women and their children. The place was bright, warm, designed to offer a haven of peace to those who were fleeing violence. During the opening ceremony, I was in front of a crowd of journalists, politicians, and sympathizers, Hope in my arms. My father was by my side, as well as Theo and Sarah, who had become precious support from the foundation. "This refuge," I started, my voice slightly trembling with emotion, "is more than a simple building. It is a symbol of hope. A place where women can find security, support, and force necessary to rebuild their life." I spoke of my personal experience, the way I went from victim to survivor, then activist. I spoke of all these women who still lived in fear and shame, prisoners of abusive relations. To all these women, I mean, you are not alone. There is hope. There is a life after violence. And we are there to help you build it. The applause that followed my speech were deafening. I lived tears in the eyes of many people present, and I felt my own throat tighten emotion. After the ceremony, while I was chatting with a few guests, a young woman timidly approached me. She looked fragile, her eyes constantly lowered, her body stretched as if she expected a blow at any time. I immediately recognized the signs. "Hello," I said slowly. "My name is Elodie. And you are?" "Marie," she whispered. I read your story in the newspapers. I am in the same situation as you before. My heart will be hugged." I entrusted Hope to my father and invited Marie to follow me in a quiet corner. "Tell me," I just say. And Marie spoke. She told me about the insults, the blows, the constant fear. She told me about her shame, her feeling of helplessness. And above all, she told me about her desperate desire to get out of it, but her terror at the idea of taking the first step. I listened to it carefully, my heart breaking a little more with each of his words. When she finished, I took her hands in mine. "Marie," I say, "what you live is not normal. It is not love. It is violence, and you do not deserve it. No one deserves it." I lived tears pouring on his cheeks. "But I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I'm afraid. I'm not nowhere to go." "Yes," I replied firmly. "You have a place to go now. Here. We can help you, Marie. You can have a new life, a life without violence." I explained to him how our refuge worked, the different forms of help we could bring him. I told him about advisors, lawyers, support groups. And above all, I told him about hope. It will not be easy, I admitted. There will be difficult times, doubts, fears. But I promise you worth it. You deserve to be happy, Marie. You deserve to be safe. At the end of our conversation, Marie agreed to stay at the refuge. When I saw her go with one of our advisors, I felt a wave of gratitude invaded me. I was able to help someone. I had been able to make a difference. That night, back home, I watched Hope to sleep peacefully in his cradle. I thought of everything that had happened since this terrible night of Theo's marriage. I had crossed hell, but I was out. I had lost a husband, but I had won so much more: a father, a girl, a goal in life. My father slowly entered the room, joining me near the cradle. "You did a good job today," he said slowly. "I'm so proud of you, Elodie." I smile at him, grateful. "Thank you, Dad. For everything. Without you, I don't know where I would be today." He passed an arm around my shoulders. "You would have gotten out of it, I'm sure. You are much stronger than you think." We thus stayed for a moment, observing Esperance, which slept peacefully, unconscious of the path traveled to get there. "You know," said my father after a moment, "when I saw you that evening, at Theo's wedding, I was terrified. I had just found you and I was afraid of losing you again. But now I realize that this moment was the beginning of something wonderful." I nodded, understanding what he meant. This horrible night had been a turning point in my life, the beginning of a long and difficult trip to healing and reconstruction. The future still scares me sometimes, I admit. Being a mother, directing the foundation, is a lot of responsibility. My father hugged my shoulder. "You are not alone, Elodie. You will never be again. And I know you're going to do wonders." I looked at Hope again, my heart overflowing with love. "You're right," I said gently. "We are going to do wonders. Together." While we left the room, leaving Hope to his dreams, I felt deep peace invade me. The path had been long and difficult, but I had finally arrived. I was finally at home. The future was full of challenges, I knew it. But for the first time in my life, I was ready to face them. I had found my voice, my strength, my goal. And with the love of my daughter and the support of my family, I knew that I could accomplish everything. It was a new start, for me and for all the women I was going to help. And I was impatient to see what the future had in store for us.